Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to start off just with just a brief intro about my topic. So I studied the fiscal decentralization more generally, and I wanted to try and quantify the effect of fiscal decentralization on infant mortality, which is a health indicator that researchers usually look at to kind of try to assess health sector efficiency, the quality of health in a certain nation. And I wanted to look at not only at one country, I wanted to look at a wide variety of countries in the OECD region, so many European countries. And the reason behind that is really because I wanted to get as much variation as you could get, and also because many of these countries have had very successful experiences with decentralizing structures and expenditures and revenues. So I wanted to try and look at the relationship between this sort of kind of decentralized structure that these countries are very well known for and their health outcomes more generally. Just a very brief introduction on what fiscal decentralization is. Fiscal decentralization is really just the process of transferring some level of authority, because this could vary from central government, so like the national government, to subnational, in order to allow these entities, these local entities, so this could be municipalities or other regions, or like states in the US, or other regional entities, to make decisions regarding taxation, their revenues, their spending. So in other words, they have this autonomous power. They are able to control the revenue and expenditure structures in order to meet local demand. So this is broadly what fiscal decentralization really is. It is a very common policy decision that governments generally around the world and recently in the developing world have been debating amongst themselves. So why is studying decentralization so important? Why did I decide to study this aspect? I think around the world, and especially now given the pandemic, there has been a stronger attention given towards the issue of fiscal federalism, or the distribution of responsibilities across different levels of government. So how much powers should we decentralize to local authorities? And what does that really mean for development? So usually the study of fiscal federalism or fiscal decentralization is welcomed and favored due to the economic efficiency gains that such a policy entails. Particularly by implementing fiscal decentralization, nations are able to improve and sustain local development through ensuring that local authorities or leaders are able to effectively provide public services, one of which is health services. And more broadly, fiscal decentralization also gives the people their power, their political participation, ability to politically participate, but also engage themselves in economic choices and decisions, and also voice their preferences so that their demands as local communities is being met. So this is more broadly the broad motivation behind my study. I think given the fact that local economies are being scrutinized more as main agents for political reform, but also for economic development, I think it's worth studying this. And I think today and right now it's more timely than ever, because we really witnessed how weakened most economic structures have become following the pandemic and the economic crises that came along with that. So it's important to question, so what can local governments really do in times like this? So I'm just gonna very briefly go over my abstract for the dissertation. My dissertation really looked at the effect of fiscal decentralization on population health across 21 OECD countries. And the way I did this is I relied on the decentralization theorem that is very well known in the literature by Oates. And this theorem really is, in simple terms, it allows us to see how when local authorities are given enough powers, financial resources, this could reduce information asymmetry And so local authorities are better fit to meet the demands of the local communities in which they encompass. So, and as a result, economic efficiency gains are absolutely going to be met. So I try to shed light on how there are different ways to measure fiscal decentralization, because often we think of fiscal decentralization as a very political topic. So I try as much as I can to try and see how can we really quantify this in economic terms in order to conduct the analysis and to reach concrete conclusions and policy recommendations. So to do so, I used different data sources and I ran a regression model for the country set of choice, which I will brief you on in a bit. And one contribution I've had to the literature is that the time span is much larger than previous studies. So I have data reaching up until 2017. And I did not limit fiscal decentralization to one aspect. I tried as much as possible to look at the expenditure aspect. So when local authorities are given the power to spend more freely, but also I looked at the indicator of tax revenue decentralization. So what would happen when governments are given the ability to set their own tax rates and gain revenue as a result? So this is more broadly the purpose of the study. I wanted to look at how certain level of fiscal decentralization, either through expenditure or tax revenue, affects population health with a focus on infant mortality. The overall result is that indeed a higher tax revenue decentralization, so when local units are given autonomy to set their own taxes, their own tax rates, infant mortality rates went downwards, which means the health outcomes are actually positive as a result. However, and I will get into this in a bit, expenditure decentralization as an indicator did not really showcase the same results. So we'll look into this right now. As I've mentioned, for my outcome variable, I looked at infant mortality, which is a very common health outcome that is usually looked at in health economics and other health-related studies. And the reason why we look at infant mortality is because it's very reactive to policy changes. So, and this has been empirically tested across time. So if there is a change in a political decision, or if there is an economic crisis, or when we look at health outcomes, infant mortality is the most consistent, and it's also the most accurate to depict changes. So that's why I decided to go with infant mortality as the outcome variable of interest. So I looked at, as I mentioned, I looked at 21 OECD countries spanning over 30 years, from the year 1972 until the year 2017. And obviously, there was a lot of centralization followed by decentralization periods, depending on different shocks like economic crises, like conflict, among many other events as well. So, which means that the data set gives me enough time variation, but it also gives me a good balance between federal and unitary countries, so that I'm able to conduct sufficient and substantive cross-country heterogeneities and differences. So it's important to also note that when we're looking at such variables like infant mortality, and since I'm looking at OECD countries, I decided that I would rely on data that is extracted from the OECD database. They have their own health database, so I relied on that for my variable of interest. So I looked at infant mortality, which is particularly defined as the number of deaths of children aged under 1 that occurred in a certain year per 1,000 live births. So one observation I was able to depict immediately for some of the countries in my sample, like you see here, so Australia, Austria, Canada, one common trend is that the infant mortality has been going downwards across time up until the year 2017 or the year 2018. So this shows that these countries are indeed healthier, and that these countries, as opposed to, let's say, developing countries, have better trends in terms of responding to health needs, one might say. So this is generally important to see because, again, I'm interested in seeing what led to this. Could it be the decentralized efforts or could it be something else? So in order to explain such variation, I obviously looked at different variables, right? So this includes my fiscal decentralization variable, my expenditure decentralization variable. So these are two variables of interest, right? And so this is the main kind of policy variable I'm interested in. I look at these two indicators separately. So I look at my tax decentralization variable alone, that is subnational tax revenue as a percentage of total government tax revenue. So what is the share of tax revenue allocated for local governments? As for expenditure, it's the same definition, but we're looking now at expenditure as a percentage of total government expenditure or spending. I also look at fractionalization, which is just it allows me to see, okay, so what also is driving such outcomes politically. And we look at fractionalization, which is just when, if two, let's say, political parties, do they agree on, are they very different on political views related to decentralization, or do they not agree? What is the probability that that two officials randomly selected from the legislature will be from different parties, from different views? Obviously, I also look at education because it is evident that a highly educated population might also seek better health services or will be more accustomed or aware of the requirements to maintain a good health. But it could be the other way around, and this is something that I was trying to also control for in my study. I look at income, that is GDP per capita. I look at the percentage of population that is covered by health insurance. I also look at how much money goes into health in general nationally. And one health determinant that is usually also utilized is the consumption of alcohol, because it's often assumed to have a negative effect on health. So I also looked at, because for the most part, I'm looking at non-medical determinants. So it would be good to also look at medical determinants to ensure that I'm controlling for enough variability in my model. So as I've mentioned, I'm looking at expenditure and tax revenue decentralization, and I've defined those a few seconds ago. So it's how much subnational expenditure is allocated to a certain local entity as a percentage of total government expenditure. And I looked also at tax revenue decentralization, which has the same definition. So particularly to calculate my figures, I used these two formulas. So the ratio as a total, as a percent. So basically the ratio in comparison to total general government, well, either for tax revenue or for expenditure. So one thing that is worth mentioning, and it is a main challenge in the literature and in the study of decentralization, really, is we really struggle to depict the level of autonomy that local governments have. Because when you're looking at shares, the share of money spent locally, you don't really, this ratio doesn't perfectly tell us how much of those decisions related to spending are fully controlled by the local government, because it could be the case that a central government has a say in how much is being spent, and this ratio does not really depict that. Because of obviously there is no data on this across the world. There is a very little data on this. So this ratio is considered to be sufficient for now. However, because we are looking at a wide time range and a wide number of countries, this should not be a problem because there is enough variation so that we are able to reach concrete and accurate conclusions. So now that I've introduced the main policy variables of interest and my outcome variable of interest, it will be good to actually look at, so what am I seeing really in this sample of interest, and in the OECD sample that I've chosen for my study? How does expenditure decentralization really look like in comparison to tax revenue decentralization? something that I immediately noticed that on average, there is more inclination towards expenditure decentralization as opposed to tax revenue decentralization. And this can be seen in the figure, right? So you can see that the percentage, the percentage or the share that governments would have, the local governments would have to spend is always much higher than what's available for tax decentralization. So the yellow color, or yeah, the yellow color, yellowish color is more on taxation, and the other one is on expenditure. However, that said, something else we could notice that across time, expenditure decentralization has been going down, but it's still superior to tax decentralization. So this gives me the sense that maybe OECD countries are more interested in devolving spending responsibilities as opposed to giving local authorities the ability to set their own taxes, right? And this is an important finding because what kind of decentralization is really driving my health outcome? And this is something I take note of. So I now look at how has tax revenue decentralization changed over time. Can we see that there's a higher percentage of tax setting capabilities going into local authorities, or is that really not the case? So I noticed that in general, yes, there is a positive trend. So we can see that there is more decentralization of taxation for the different countries in my data set. But it's more or less stable, right? Because you can see for some countries, yes, there is a very clear upward trend, but for some other countries, there is some sort of stability. Or for even some a certain sample of those countries, we see kind of like a cyclical relationship, or sorry, a cyclical view where we see, okay, so there was modest amount of taxes being decentralized, but then this went up, but then it went down again. So, and this is all related to the different political, economic circumstances within each country, because they really drive these decisions in terms of how much power should we give local authorities. So that is for taxation. We see, yes, there is a clear trend towards decentralization, but it's more or less modest. When I look at spending decentralization, we really see it, right? We see that spending decentralization is clearly evident. We see that there is an upward trend. There is the shares of spending that are within the jurisdiction of local authorities are higher across time, right? Of course, for some countries it's more stable, but generally the trend is that there is an increase in decentralizing expenditure across time for the countries of interest. And this is important, right? Because again, it fits into the analysis. So what does this really mean? Because it could be maybe a stable tax revenue decentralization is enough for health outcomes to kind of be relatively well, right? But so it doesn't mean that because there is more decentralization of spending, that health outcomes would definitely be highly reactive to that, right? And this is something that we will be seeing in a bit. So here, something that I've noticed is that when I wanted to capture this very simple relationship between tax revenue decentralization and infant mortality, I noticed there's a very clear trend, right? So however, it's not, we can see that it's not a large variation. So when there is, the blue colored curve is my infant mortality, and the red one is my tax revenue decentralization variable, right? So I see that when, for example, for Switzerland, when tax revenue decentralization was going up, so when the shares were higher, we saw that infant mortality was also going down. And the same, we see something maybe in a more modest way for Spain, for the US. So yes, indeed, we can see that based on a very simple graphic, tax revenue decentralization might be driving better health outcomes across some of these countries. Obviously, this is a very simplified setup because we have to control for many other variables, which I've spoken about briefly at the beginning of the presentation. And this is just showing you the rest, the remaining of the countries, and still the conclusion still stands. We look at Iceland, for example. We see that as tax revenue decentralization was more evident and more clear. So as the share of taxes was higher, we saw that the infant mortality was going down. So what about spending decentralization and infant mortality? What was really happening here, right? So we see that because of like the availability of data in comparison to taxes is a bit more modest here, I would say. So across time, there is more data on tax revenue as opposed to spending at the local level. But still, we do see that as there is a higher decentralization of expenditures, infant mortality was going down, meaning that there are better health outcomes. And we could look at Sweden, for example, United States. These are some good examples of that. So I think there's not much left of my presentation, but just to brief you on what is the empirical strategy that I really used to depict these results or to conduct such an analysis. I really adopted a very popular model, a theoretical model that has been used extensively by people like Segaresco, Ribio, Robellino, which is simply using a health production function. So using my mortality rate as the outcome variable, and then looking at different inputs that feed into this variable. So what could be driving my infant mortality variable? What are the factors or the variables that are really changing the reality of the health sector in a certain country? So this is a bit technical, but this is just a fixed effect regression showing me the mortality rate as my outcome variable, where we look at the unit of analysis I, which is the country here, and the time variable, which is being year in this case. Z here, the letter Z is just the set of variables that I'm controlling for in my study. So it's just summarizing it by one letter, that is the variable Z. And this symbol you see, that is the composite error term, it's just a listing of other factors that could be contributing or creating some sort of variation in the model, and these should be taken into account in the econometric estimation. So I use different models, right, to conduct my analysis. I use the basic model, which is looking at the infant mortality, and then looking at how does this decentralization variable affect my mortality rate. And then I also look at the expenditure. So remember, we have two decentralization variables, and I simply look at the effect of that on my mortality variable. But then I decided to kind of extend this, right? And I wanted to look at other control variables that could be causing some sort of variation in my health outcome variable, which is mortality rate. So I look at the expenditure on health, the percentage of expenditure on health as a percentage of GDP. I look at the enrollment in education. I look at health insurance. And I also look at the income per capita in the country, because these are all variables that really matter, because they can be assumed to be related to mortality rate. So the reason why we include so much controls and so much variables, because if I simply look at the decentralization variable and ignore other factors, then what I'm doing here is that I'm kind of inflating the effect of the decentralization variable, because I'm really interested in looking at the true effect of decentralization on mortality rates. So I want to purge this variable from other effects and ensure that I'm actually looking at the concrete kind of true effect, true impact that decentralization has on health in this study. So I do the same regression for both decentralization variables. So my first decentralization variable, that is FD1, is my tax revenue decentralization variable, and the second one is my expenditure decentralization variable. Now, the final model I use is just looking at, similarly, we look at decentralization among other variables like health expenditure, education, among others. But something that I want to also depict is this issue of autonomy. Remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned something on how sometimes the ratio, looking at just the ratio of, let's say, local expenditure as a total of as a percentage of total general expenditure, doesn't really tell me if a local government has full control over this, because it's just simply looking at the amount of money that a local government can spend and tracking this across time. But it doesn't really tell me whether the local government has full autonomy over it. So I relied on a variable that I call here auton, which is autonomous. And it's basically, we call it a dummy variable that would take a value of 1 if a country has autonomous capabilities, so they have the ability to set their own taxes. So local governments have the ability to set their own taxes, to spend, etc. So I know this is a bit technical, but what's happening here is that as we've seen in the earlier regressions, we look at FD1 and FD2. Here I'm just summarizing it as FD, but obviously we look at each separately. But then I also include an additional term in this regression, which is FD star or multiplied by auton, which is this is just an interaction term. It shows me just how this interaction, what would happen to the effect on health if we were an autonomous region, right? So it allows me to look at this aspect of decentralization, right? Which is an addition and the contribution to the literature by factoring in this new variation, right? Do the results vary when I control for autonomy in a certain country, or not really? So now onto my results. So it shows here that, for example, using my very basic model, so going back, apologies. So going back to this very basic model, model 1, I'm just looking at what is the effect of tax revenue decentralization on health. So it shows that indeed, tax revenue decentralization, so when there is a higher share of tax revenue locally, we see that infant mortality was going down, which is a good thing. It means that there are less deaths, right? And it is highly significant, which is this 2 stars. It just signifies that the result is actually consistent and is significant. But then when I look at expenditure decentralization, so when we decentralize spending decisions, the effect is rather small and insignificant. This could be related to, for example, maybe because we are not controlling for anything here, we're just looking at the interaction between health and decentralization. So we're now looking at the more expansive models and see if this really changes or not. So now when we look at tax revenue decentralization, when we look at expenditure decentralization, etc. But by looking at, we further the analysis by looking at the education, income, so that's GDP per capita, health expenditure, health insurance. We notice that the effect of tax revenue decentralization is still significant, smaller, but still significant. And so health outcomes are still improving. But when I go all the way to expenditure decentralization, the effect is even smaller and it's still insignificant. So I'm starting to kind of maybe see that maybe because there's not enough data on expenditure decentralization, or maybe because it's indeed not really, maybe expenditure is just not really reflecting local reform, right? It's not really, maybe decentralizing spending is not really helping local authorities to meet the health demands of their citizens. Maybe by collecting more taxes and gaining more revenue, they are able to use such revenues for to meet such demands. Maybe that's a better, more efficient source for the local government. These are all important findings and questions that are worth considering. So then I look at what would happen if I'm studying autonomy. Remember this last model, which is the new contribution to the study. I noticed that when I include this autonomy aspect, the tax revenue decentralization variable, so the very first row, loses its significance. So there are no stars there, right? But then the autonomy interacted with tax revenue decentralization. So a share of taxes decentralized given autonomy is highly significant. It's really highly significant, and the magnitude is even bigger. And we have the correct sign as we expect. We expect that health outcomes to be better. The infant mortality is less, right? For expenditure decentralization, which it's the sole variable still has an insignificant coefficient, as we've seen in the previous regressions. But then when I interacted with autonomy, it took the right sign we would expect, which is a negative sign, and it is highly significant, which means that the results are consistent. So perhaps this could mean that when local authorities have the autonomy to decide how much they're going to spend without so much control from central governments, this could mean that health outcomes could indeed be positively correlated with expenditure decentralization, or in other words, infant mortality would be going down as a result. So I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. This is just saying that in general, in order to ensure our estimates are consistent and that there is not endogeneity, there is not bias in the results in the coefficient of our decentralization variables, we use something in econometrics that is instrumental variable methods. And there are certain variables that I could use to do so. These are natural resource rents and fractionalization. Both are highly correlated with decentralization, and I'm able, using such variables, to kind of, in simple terms, run my regression, run my analysis by looking at two-level regression, basically, and the results persist, right? We still have, when I conduct this endogeneity solution, I noticed that, yes, indeed, decentralization in an unbiased way reduces infant mortality, or in other words, improves health outcomes. So this is my final slide. Just to kind of summarize, fiscal decentralization in general seems to have a negative association with infant mortality rates for the sample study. But this was at first most clearly seen when we looked at tax revenue decentralization. For expenditure decentralization, this wasn't as obvious, right? However, when we controlled for the autonomy aspect of local governments, this was more clearly captured. This is why I say here, more generally, and when we factor in certain variables like autonomy, decentralization indeed can make populations more healthy. And this is something I think is a prominent finding in a way, because given that, if you just think of the pandemic, right, we see that the health sectors around the world have been fully exhausted. Health resources have been fully exhausted. Health actors are completely kind of like squeezed out of their capabilities. There is just so much that is demanded from the health sector and from the economy as well. And the typical orthodox kind of economic system that is very capital intensive really has really failed the world, right? We saw that a very centralized approach to economic policymaking did not really save us from the pandemic. And the evidence of that is that governments were really not sure what to do. Should we prioritize the economy or should we prioritize the health sector, which is a very kind of ethical dilemma to have. And I don't think communities, local communities, and people in general should be faced with such a policy dilemma. So I think this kind of focusing on a localized approach to economic policy making, to meeting demands, to local governance is just really important at this stage, because local authorities are best fit to meet the local demands of their people, because a central government representative won't really know what a local community in a very distant village really demands in terms of health or in terms of other services. So when we are giving local authorities the ability to actually conduct policy making to a certain extent, we are basically giving communities a lifeline in situations like a pandemic or an economic crisis. And I think the results of my study were able to capture exactly this, because even in the most developed of countries, such as OECD countries, the health sector was completely exhausted, and it became super frail at some point. But I do believe, based on the results and based on my knowledge, that if local authorities were indeed given enough financial capabilities, and if fiscal federalism, or in other words, the distribution of resources across level of governments was indeed optimal and efficient, the response to the pandemic could have been better, and health outcomes could have been better, and a lot of lives could have been saved. So in general, I think it's really important to rethink the global economy and try to start to prioritize what is there for us in the local economy to actually get a hold of and kind of like exploit to a certain extent. There is a lot of economic and political power that local governments encompass, and I think national governments have not really prioritized this as a policy decision. So looking at decentralization is one way to actually capture this. And just to kind of bring further light to the importance of the findings of the study, obviously, when I'm looking at such relationships, these are short-term relationships, right? Just they don't really depict, for each country, for example, they're just relatively looking at short-term changes. So I also conducted regressions, which I didn't really include here to avoid us time loss. There is indeed a long-run relationship between health and decentralization across certain countries. So indeed, decentralization on the long run can improve health outcomes, which is kind of reassuring, right? Because it tells us that on the long run, if we really commit to effective decentralization, given obviously correct institutional setup and given accountability mechanisms, health outcomes can be improved around the world. And obviously, local economy and local economic development and economic growth more generally can be guaranteed. Because obviously, if you have a healthy population, then you have an active population that will contribute to the economy, either locally but also nationally. And that is it. This concludes my presentation. That will be the findings of my dissertation conducted during my master's.
Thank you, Hussein. For people who have, I actually do have a bit of experience with local government and trying to understand their budgeting as well. So for me, this was really valuable. Who knew, right? Of course, experts might know, but at our kind of level of engaging with government, it's incredible to see how decentralization, but people are very big on decentralization, but you need to still do it right. And that was a very cool finding. There's no point just doing expenditure decentralization. The significance of those findings were just so insignificant. And also you were talking about the further implications and the further the next steps of how your research could go. There were also some variables though that were very significant. For example, education. You didn't really touch upon that.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean that was off the charts. But if you could just explain, I hope I didn't miss that, but I don't think you explained deeply into what exactly it meant that education was that significant.
Absolutely, yeah. I try to as much as possible, because I know I took more time than I promised. But the education aspect is really, first of all, as I've mentioned, it's because I want to capture a comprehensive relationship, right? I don't want to limit myself to just decentralization, because realistically speaking, there are many factors that feed into health, right?
Right.
So education is one of them, because generally, when there is a highly educated population, we would assume, and this is based on empirical study, that such individuals would regularly seek informed health advice, meaning that they would seek the right channels in order to cater for their own health needs, which would obviously ensure better health outcomes. And this could also obviously also relate to education institutions and how they also utilize and kind of integrate health knowledge within their setup, right? So definitely education, and we would expect indeed to have a significant relationship between education and health as a result. Yeah. So specifically, what this is saying is that when the enrollment when the enrollment in education institution increases by 1%, we see that on average across countries, the countries that we have, infant mortality would be going down by around 0.15 percentage points. So obviously, as you see here, the numbers are, though the numbers are small, right? It's 0.15. But the reason why that's the case is because we're looking at 21 countries and we're looking at like averages across time. But had I looked at one country, for example, so like let's say I looked at Australia, we would have seen a much larger magnitude, obviously. But because this is averaging across a high number of countries, that's why. But we still see that the relationship is highly significant. So yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hussein, for that fantastic presentation. We are back to normal view now, gallery view. But as a person with like a background in local government as well, I mean, understanding local government budgets, for me, this study was just fantastic, especially in the light of the pandemic and how the government is handling finances and, centralized health systems. But I guess, I mean, there's just so much. I'm really, really impressed with your methodology, I must say. And that's one reason I really wanted to talk to you, because your methodology was very, very rigorous, and one of the more rigorous methodologies I've come across so far. So it's really exciting for me to be able to present this. And I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to put together a presentation as well. So thanks once again, Hussein.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Your work.
Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, Hussein has actually agreed to be available. You could write to me in the email address below and we can connect you with Hussein. So thanks again and bye-bye.
Amazing. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.